Hi. Human beings are great comparators. We are always comparing ourselves against somebody else or something else. And in fact, it seems to me that we always have to make a comparison, otherwise we're not really quite sure where we are. I'm better than him, he's not as good as me. She's more attractive than me, she's thinner than me, she's fatter than me, he's taller than me, he's more successful than me, he has more money than me, he's cleverer than me, he's not as clever as me, she is taller than me but cleverer than me. Just comparison after comparison after comparison. It's quite an interesting story. I'm not sure if it's true, but it makes an interesting illustration. In the 1950s, a company released a bread maker, the first automatic bread making machine. And they put it out in the market, and they charged some money for it, and people didn't buy it. So they thought about it, consulted a marketing expert, and then they put out another bread maker, and they charged more for that bread maker. And now people had a comparison. They could buy the expensive one or the cheaper one, and they bought the cheaper one. So once there's a means of comparison, we can kind of then position our attitude to something, or our attitude to ourselves, against a benchmark, if you like. So the process of comparison is absolutely fundamental to our insertion of ourselves into our sense of where things are, our sense of community, family, etc. I am me compared to you and you and you, and that's how I know I am within the bounds of normality, or within the bounds of acceptability within the culture that I'm in. That's okay as far as it goes. But often people consult me who are anxious or depressed, but when we examine their life history, there isn't any obvious reason why they would be anxious or depressed. Sometimes people are anxious, they've had a childhood event or an event in adult life that sensitizes them to danger, because of course anxiety is generally an overestimation of threat. So people that come to see me may not have had an experience in childhood or in adulthood which would warrant an anxiety response. Likewise, people can be very successful and still feel that they're unable to cope, or that they're not actually successful, or they may feel a failure. Their comparison process might somehow not be calibrated to the world in which they live, but somehow seems to be calibrated to something else, something internal. So this brings us to the important point. We are always comparing ourselves to other people and other things, okay, but we can also compare ourselves to internal standards. And when we compare ourselves to internal standards, often we can find that we are failing to adequately live up to those standards that we've set ourselves. Let me just illustrate this like this. So here, that's the range of possible standards. This is a 0, this is a 100. Now, if you have any perfectionist tendencies, or if you hold very high standards, you're going to want to achieve this level here of 100, the standard of 100, absolute success. But of course no one can be perfect, no one is perfect. Perfect is not an end state that anyone can achieve. Likewise, you can never not make mistakes. Likewise, you can never not achieve this hypothetical perfect high level of performance. But anything less than this gives you a means of comparison. So if you're working really, really hard, you're busy, it's the modern economy, and you're achieving, say, 85%, now that is probably highly effective, highly efficient, absolutely fine. But it's not 100%. And that gap there provides you a means of comparison. You can look at that gap and say, I'm not doing that, therefore I am failing by 15%. And that then can be a cause of anxiety, or it can be a cause of depression, depending upon which way your comparator works. So what we have to do in this situation is this. We could strive to do things more perfectly, but as I've said, it's impossible to be perfect. It's impossible to do things adequately to get to this number all the time. And just like most people that I would ever see who have a stress-related problem have tried to get up there, and it's the trying to get to that point is the thing that does for you. So we can't try to be here at 100. What we can do, however, is to try to be satisfied with 85%. In practice, 85% is probably more and better and more efficient and actually more competent than many people actually. So this new baseline of 85% has to become satisfactory. As we make this satisfactory, we start to defeat the comparison process. And by starting to defeat the comparison process, we start to limit our self-criticism for not being up there. This will then reduce our tendency towards feeling anxious because I'm not there, and it will reduce our tendency to criticize ourselves because I'm not there. In essence, you can only ever do the best you can do. If you're a goalkeeper in the Premiership and you couldn't stand to let in goals, you hated goals, then you would never really go on the pitch, because even the best keeper, even the best goalkeeper knows that they have to concede goals. A goalkeeper has to let goals in because no one's perfect, but that's not the point. It's not even the point of how many goals you let in. It's how many goals you let in and how many goals the other goalkeeper lets in. You could let 5 in, but if they let 6 in, you're the star. And then it's not one game, is it? It's a whole aggregate of games over the season. And it's not how many goals you let in, because you could let in more goals, but actually your team could win the league. It's how many goals you let in and everyone else lets in on any particular game. So it's actually quite a complicated system. But if a goalkeeper simply said, oh, I must not let in goals, they'd never get on the pitch. They'd never play. They'd never make gazillions of money, never have a wag for a wife and a Ferrari, never actually achieve any success. So we have to recognize that good enough is generally good enough. And even then, it's not our good enough, it's our good enough in relationship to everybody else. And you know, the systems that we work in are relatively complex. So by recognizing this comparative process and by focusing on doing a good enough job, but not a perfect job, because you can't do a perfect job, you actually start to get more control over how you feel about being at work or whatever it is that you make the comparison about. And this recognition of the comparative process defeats anxiety and it defeats depression. So get out there and save goals, let goals in. What's important is being in the game. Thanks for taking the time to watch and listen.